Good morning, metalheads of the internet, and welcome to a very special new episode of the Metal Meltdown. Today, we are reviewing every single studio album from nu metal pioneers and legends, Korn, my favorite band named after a fucking vegetable. No disrespect to Sweet Potato, mind you. Very solid runner-up. Asparagus, not so much. Those guys fucking suck. I figured since Korn have a brand new album coming out in about 2 weeks or so, this was a perfect opportunity to revisit the discography of one of the most prolific metal bands of the past 30 years. Especially since, quite frankly, I haven't really listened to a whole lot of Korn's music, aside from the debut, Follow the Leader, and more controversial records like The Path of Totality. As per the norm with any video of this type on the Metal Meltdown, I will be talking about each album in order of release. I will be assigning each a score out of 5, with 0 being the lowest and 5 being the highest. And I also want to stress that I am not interested in any EPs, demos, live albums, or compilations. I'm also not interested in any solo albums or side projects. I am focusing specifically on the 13 studio albums that Korn has already released. If you want to hear my thoughts on Requiem, guess what? You're gonna have to wait 2 weeks when the album fucking comes out. So don't bother asking me now. First up, we have the band's debut self-titled record, Korn, released October 11th, 1994 via Epic and Immortal Records. Inarguably the first nu metal album ever conceived, and it's aged pretty fucking decent-ish, kind of. Yeah. It's kind of weird, man, because as much as this does sound like a quintessentially 90s alt-metal, nu metal record, it's conceptually and lyrically kind of timeless. You know, it occupies a space very similar to that of Nevermind from Nirvana. It belongs to a very specific time and a very specific place and a very specific genre. But it remains poignant, it remains effective, and it remains remarkably accessible because the things that the album is talking about are so real and so common. Unlike so many other metal bands before them, Korn aren't talking about how many girls they've fucked, how many rad parties they've been to. They're not talking about historical battles or Satan or witchcraft or anything like that. They're talking about real shit. They're talking about things that affect them and have affected them on a deeply personal level. They're detailing their experiences with child abuse and bullying, and they're talking about drug addiction and alcohol abuse and being lonely and angry. I know this sounds a touch ridiculous to younger metalheads, but the fact is, before Korn, before bands like Korn, metal bands didn't really talk about their emotions, and if they did, it was often through some kind of wild analogy or metaphor. It was often against the backdrop of some picturesque landscape, some kind of Lord of the Rings World War II fantasy. Not Korn, though. They tell you exactly what they're feeling, when they're feeling it, and why they're feeling it. They are telling you point blank what is on their mind in often gruesome and explicit detail. And as such, there is a certain level of darkness and youthful anger to this record that makes it surprisingly still very poignant all these years later. The track Helmet in the Bush, for instance, is all about Jonathan Davis's addiction to meth, whereas the track Clown is inspired by a real-life incident in which Jonathan Davis and the band's manager got into a fistfight with a literal neo-Nazi, a skinhead. And there's also the highly controversial, which I'm now realizing I might have to censor, which details Jonathan Davis's experience growing up in Bakersfield, California, going to high school and wearing eyeliner and being really into a lot of like goth and punk rock and death metal and being bullied because he was weird and he was strange and he didn't look or sound or act like normal teenagers. So everyone just told him he was a That is where this album grabs my fucking attention by the balls. Where it loses me is the actual quality of the music. I mean, it's not terrible by any stretch, but it's just messy and clumsy as fuck. I've always kind of cringed at, like, some of Jonathan Davis's, like, really wild vocal acrobatics, the scatting, the beatboxing, all that stuff. This is definitely that style at its worst, in my opinion. The sound mix is also way too muddy for its own good. A lot of the riffs feel and flow the same. There are a couple decent grooves and hooks here and there, but musically, this album really doesn't do a fucking thing for me. I'm honestly gonna give this thing a 2.5 out of 5. I still love the lyrics. I still love how brutally honest and raw this thing is. I still think it holds up mostly, but yeah, the music just really does not do a fucking thing for me on this. Next up, we have Life is Peachy, released October 15th, 1996 via Immortal and Epic. And immediately, I think this is a much stronger record. Not perfect, not even great, but definitely stronger. The music is a little bit more dynamic and versatile. There are a lot of weird, ominous, and anxious melodies. The very schizophrenic, demented vocal scatting is, I think, better implemented, aside from that really annoying opening cut. There's some more funky bass lines, some more hip-hop kind of rhythms, which I think are really cool. They give this thing a little bit of extra bounce and momentum. I do think, lyrically speaking, the first album is a bit more impactful and emotional, but there's still some pretty strong stuff on this. For instance, Kill You is written all about Jonathan Davis's stepmother. The song Swallows is about drug-induced paranoia. The song Ass Itch is about Korn basically doubting their ability as songwriters and as musicians. It does lose me a little bit with the song. It's a little bit too vulgar and incel-friendly for my personal liking, but there's still a pretty raw, uncompromising anger to this that I think I might have found charming as a young fucking teenage edgelord. I even weirdly have a soft spot for Korn's cover of Wicked, originally an Ice Cube cut, now featuring Chino Moreno of Deftones on vocals as well. I think I would give this a very enthusiastic 3 out of 5. Definitely a big improvement on the debut. It's got the lyrics, it's got the songs, it's got the production. It's not the most consistent, and sometimes, like in the case of it's a little too edgy for its own good, but overall I think it's a pretty decent record. Next up, we have Follow the Leader, released August 18th, 1998 via Immortal and Epic Records. And ladies and gentlemen, we have arrived at what I feel is Korn's best album. Finally, everything that defines Korn makes sense and is brought together into something cohesive, into something fulfilling, into something consistent and genuinely entertaining. The songwriting is still very dark, very personal, very much on par with the debut, I would say. It's also clear that Jonathan Davis has learned from the controversy of some other tracks on some other albums. This isn't as vulgar, it's not as over-the-top, edgy, and stupid. And it's not just a matter of restraint. I feel as if there is actual maturity in the songwriting. Like, Korn have grown as people, as young men, as musicians, and it is consistently reflected in the songwriting. And not just the lyrics, might I add. The music, it fucking rules on this thing. Got the Life remains as ridiculously catchy now as it did the first time I heard it years ago. I love that really funky, dirty bass line contrasted with that kind of 90s hip-hop rhythm and that big, bold kind of 90s rock chorus. Tracks like Dead Bodies Everywhere, Children of the Corn, BBK, and Seed are genuinely very eerie. Like, if Korn ever made music for a horror movie, I am certain this is what they would have contributed. All in the Family does lose me, thanks to the addition of Limp Bizkit's Fred Durst. But I'll shut my mouth about that because I despise Limp Bizkit, so therefore I'm biased, so we will move on. And to be fair, the album does win me back with Freak on a Leash, which I think unironically is Korn's best song even after all these years. It's got a great beat, it's got a really great chorus, and even Jonathan's scattered vocals are pretty well implemented. Not my cup of tea, but considering how objectively weird and jarring this type of vocal performance is, this is probably the best it could be implemented into, well, any music. For me, this is a strong 4 out of 5. I think this is one of the better nu metal albums to come out of the late 90s, and I would still argue Korn's best album to date. If you're brand new to Korn, this is the album I would recommend you check out, personally speaking. Next up, we have Issues, released November 16th, 1998 via Epic and Immortal Records, and I think it's totally, completely okay. Yeah, I don't have a lot to say about this album. We're reaching that point in Korn's discography and Korn's career where they're starting to become a bit of a one-trick pony. They're still doing that one trick pretty well, but it's not as effective here as it was on Follow the Leader or even on Life is Peachy or the debut. It's a little heavier, a little murkier, but the lyrics aren't as strong and the music ultimately isn't as poignant. It's not horrible, but it is really, really forgettable. At least I think it is. I legitimately didn't remember anything about this album until I listened to it again in preparation for this. And even right now, I'm struggling to remember a lot of stuff that I really liked about this album. I'm going to go with a 2 out of 5. I like that this album is shorter. Normally, Korn albums run at about an hour long or over an hour long. This is 53 minutes. That doesn't make a huge difference in the grand scheme of things, but it's something kind of positive, I guess. I don't know. 2 out of 5. Here's hoping the next album is a little bit more exciting. Which, of course, brings us to Untouchables, released June 11th, 2002 via Immortal and Epic Records. Unfortunately, it is not a more exciting record. It is exactly as exciting as Issues was, and now it's a little bit longer, and it really does feel like Korn is just going through the motions at this point. I don't know what it is, man, but the authenticity, the darkness, the brutal honesty that I really appreciated about those early records, and the killer tunes that eventually did follow, that's just not present here. I feel about this exactly how I felt about Issues, so 2 out of 5, once again, moving on. And that brings us to Take a Look in the Mirror, released November 21st, 2003. And, I mean, I don't really like repeating myself, but yeah. It's not very good. The circumstances surrounding the creation and eventual release of this album had a visible impact on it. Anybody attempting to argue otherwise is objectively wrong. There's a lot of tension behind the scenes, and Brian Welch has decided this is going to be his last album with the band. Nu metal is also getting less and less popular, and Korn, for some reason, think that in order to survive, they need to get louder, they need to get more aggressive, and the result is a clumsy mess that almost resembles an ugly caricature of what Korn used to be. It's lame, it's predictable, there's not a single emotion conveyed on this album that feels genuine, that feels authentic. It really is Korn just going through the fucking motions. I would give this a 1.5 out of 5. I think this is a bad record. Maybe the diehard Korn fans will be able to pull something a little bit more fulfilling out of this. I fucking couldn't, and therefore didn't. Next up, we have See You on the Other Side, released December 6th, 2005 via EMI and Virgin Records, and it's objectively better, I guess. It's not great, but it's better. I'll take that. Fuck it. What's interesting about this album is that instead of working with somebody like Ross Robinson or Brendan O'Brien, who they've worked with in the past, Korn instead taps Atticus Ross, a frequent Nine Inch Nails collaborator, to co-produce the record alongside a gentleman by the name of The Matrix, who at the time was well known for producing hit singles for the likes of Avril Lavigne and Britney Spears. As a result, the album plays out more like a hefty, muscular, somewhat poppy hybrid of like Korn's particular brand of nu metal and some 90s industrial metal. There are a lot of thick, chugging riffs. The percussion is very tight and very clean. There are some industrial tidbits and samples and some anxious soundscapes. Jonathan is showing a little bit more range as a singer. He's actually impressed me quite a lot vocally on tracks like 10 or a Two-Way and on Hypocrites, the latter of which has probably one of the most interesting kind of vocal lines and melodies on the record. Korn clearly wanted to make something that was really heavy, but also wanted to make something that was really catchy, and I appreciate that. It's clear that they realized that making a one-dimensional Korn nu metal record just wasn't going to cut it at this point. Do I think it's an amazing record? No. In fact, I think it's pretty edgy, too so for its own good. I think some of the lyrics are really cringy and in turn really obnoxious, but I did get more out of this than like the last 3 records, so fuck it. I'll go with a 2.5 out of 5, a very enthusiastic one. Props for trying. Props for trying. Yeah. Next up, we have an Untitled album. Literally, this album does not have an official title. Most people just call it Untitled. We are going to do the same. Untitled was released July 31st, 2007 via an EMI and Virgin Records. And finally, something I kind of consistently enjoy. It's been a while, but I actually do like this record. They've clearly learned from the successes and failures of See You on the Other Side and some other records that came before it. This album has a bit of an alt-rock, alt-metal vibe, which I appreciate. They're straying further away from some of the nu metal elements of their sound. I think it's a good thing, though. Don't get me wrong, there are still some weird vocal antics. There are still some really personal, disturbing lyrics and some funky bass lines, but I think going in a much more straightforward alt-metal route, but with their take on it, was a great idea. I like how much more minimalistic the production of this record is in comparison to the somewhat obnoxious kind of pop industrial nu metal of See You on the Other Side. I like how dynamic the record is. There's a lot of twists and turns, a lot of fun little tidbits. Despite that, it never feels overwhelming, it never alienates, it never confuses. Korn just focuses on writing some really fun, simple alt-rock, alt-metal with some weird nu metal flourishes, and I think it works out pretty well. It's by no means a mind-blowing experience, but it is pretty well made, and I would argue the best thing that Korn made in the 2000s. So I would give this a 3.5 out of 5. It's pretty good. Check it out. Why not? At least it's better than the last few. Next up, we have Korn's 9th studio album, which for some reason is called Korn III. I don't know why. Maybe one of you can tell me why. Whatever. But it was released July 13th, 2010 via Roadrunner Records. What we've got here, ladies and gentlemen, is a classic good news, bad news scenario. The bad news is that Atticus Ross and The Matrix are no longer working alongside Korn at this point as producers and songwriters, and as such, Korn have decided that they're done experimenting for now and would like to return to a more straightforward nu metal sound on par with that of Life is Peachy and the debut record. The good news is that they've now brought Ross Robinson back into the mix, and this is a guy who knows exactly what buttons to push and what knobs to twist in order to make a nu metal album, even a very derivative one, sound really fucking good. So instead of sounding like a colossal slog on par with Take a Look in the Mirror or Untouchables, Korn III actually has some genuine enthusiasm and weight and momentum to it. It sounds authentic, it's dark, it's everything that the first 3 records did really well, but a little bit more slick, a little bit more modern, and a little bit more mature. And as such, I think it makes for a great album. I am not exaggerating at all. I think this is a great album. Maybe I've been driven crazy by listening to all these Korn albums back to back, but c'est la vie. I think it's fucking great. Whereas on some other records we've talked about, it felt like Korn was really phoning it in. Here it feels like they really give a shit about this classic sound and have something to contribute. They've got some fucking shit that they need to talk about, and they fucking say it, and remarkably, they do all of this in a very short amount of time. The album is just shy of 45 minutes, and doesn't really have a lot of fat or filler to speak of. I think this is a great album. I'm giving this a 4 out of 5. I did not at all expect to like this as much as I did, but I'm not fucking complaining, because liking music is a good thing, obviously, and also because it does not take long for Korn to return to their usual stupidity. In fact, there is a massive downward spike in quality immediately following this album. Which, of course, finally brings us to The Path of Totality, released December 6th, 2011, via Roadrunner Records. I fucking hate this album. Plain and fucking simple. It is a loud and grating experience that combines the worst aspects of both nu metal and dubstep. It is unrelenting in how stupid and fucking obnoxious it is. If I had the time and the money, I would track down every single physical copy of this album and any merch tied to this album, and I would put it all in a rocket, and I would send that rocket directly into the fucking sun, because I fucking hate this album. I hate this album with every single fiber of my fucking being. 0 out of 5. Fuck this album. It is a truly sinful catastrophe. A nightmarish experience, and something that I would not wish upon my worst fucking enemy. I hate this. Next up, we have The Paradigm Shift, released October 7th, 2013 via a bunch of labels, apparently. Prospect Park, Caroline, and Universal. I guess they all share custody of Korn at this point. It's better than Path of Totality. That's about it. That's all I gotta say. It is like really inoffensive, boring, forgettable pop metal with some electronic elements and some nu metal elements. The only thing worth talking about is Brian Welch's return to the band. Clearly it didn't make much of a difference, because the album fucking sucks. But there you have it. I don't know. I really don't have anything else to say about this fucking thing. 1 out of 5. It's terrible. Yeah. That's it. Next up, we have The Serenity of Suffering, released October 21st, 2016 via Roadrunner Records. Much like Korn III, it is a return to form for the band, trading out the experimental pop metal, dubstep metal fusions of the past two records with a more straightforward nu metal sound, very much in line with the classic Korn records. It's not bad, but I think at this point I'm just kind of like done with the really straightforward Korn shtick. It's very cookie cutter. It's very predictable. I think at this point, Korn are a bit of a one-trick pony, and they're not really doing that one trick very well anymore. They kind of got lucky with Korn III because they had a producer that really understood them and understood what they were aiming for. I think Nick Raskulinez, that's the rum coming in, I think he's a good producer. He's just not as strong, and Korn don't sound quite as amped up, quite as inspired, and the album isn't quite as memorable as a result. I like the heaviness and the intensity of this. It's definitely the darkest and the boldest that Korn have sounded in a while, but it's just not really doing anything for me personally. I'm going to go with a 2.5 out of 5. It's okay. And then we're going to move on to the final record, because I'm really starting to lose it. I've drank a lot of rum off camera. I'm going to edit out a lot of scenes where I'm just straight up chugging rum. And this now brings us to the band's 13th studio album, The Nothing, released September 13th, 2019 via Roadrunner and Elektra Records. I think this is definitely an improvement on Serenity of Suffering. Nick Raskulinecz has definitely learned how to work with Korn a little bit better. He understands how to execute their sound better. The record is more dynamic. The guitars are actually quite punchy and still very murky and muddy in classic Korn fashion. But what's most impressive about this album is Jonathan Davis. It's not exactly a secret that his best lyrics and vocals are often born out of really traumatic experiences. And for this particular album, Jonathan Davis was still dealing with the loss of his mother and his wife, and as such, there's a lot of really dark, negative energy that goes directly into this record and in turn coming out of it. And that alone makes this record the hit that it is. I mean, across this album, it really does sound like he's having a severe emotional breakdown. I don't think he has sounded this confused and sad and angry and alone since the fucking debut. There is not a single moment on this album where you are not feeling every single thing that Jonathan Davis is feeling, that you're not feeling deep in the pit of your gut. I feel like I'm at a funeral service. I feel like I'm sitting there with Jonathan, like a therapist patting him on the back and telling him to let it all out, like a brother trying to console him, like a longtime friend bringing him flowers and making sure that he's okay. I'm not huge on a lot of the actual music on here, much like Serenity of Suffering. I think it suffers from being just a very predictable cookie-cutter record, relying on the same tropes and cliches that, ironically, Korn invented and defined and pioneered. But Jonathan Davis is so powerful that it just doesn't fucking matter. He sells every single second of this. Like, he could have literally been crying his heart out over fucking samples of someone shitting in the fucking public washroom. I don't think it would have mattered. He is so good as a lyricist and as a singer on here that he just knocks it out of the fucking park. He's the star of the fucking show. And to a certain extent, Korn know that because they themselves reel back a bit at certain times to just let him shine and vent. It's extremely rare to see any rock band as old as Korn still releasing music this emotionally vulnerable and brutally honest at this point in their fucking career. So mad fucking props to Korn even for that alone. I'm going to give this album a 3.5 out of 5. Not my favorite Korn album musically, but it's hard to ignore the absolute powerhouse juggernaut performance that Jonathan delivers on here. And voila! That's it! This took way longer than I expected. Oh my god. And I drank a lot of rum. I'm gonna drink some more while I edit this fucking video. Press this button for updates on the Metal Meltdown so you can subscribe and all that shit. Tell me what your favorite or least favorite Korn album was. Tell me how wrong you think I am. And have a great fucking day. Or don't. Your fucking prerogative. Cheers. I don't ever want to do this again. Yeah, we're done here.